All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. Fascism is a relatively new political idea. In fact, the term itself, fascism, was coined by Mussolini in the 20th century. And this is in part because fascism is really a reaction against the modern world. It's a reaction against our post-Enlightenment political theories. And by post-Enlightenment, I mean, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, people that we were talking about with liberalism and social contract theory. Fascism really is a modern reaction to that. Mussolini looking around, and he sees that there's a lot of problems with our modern world, with the way that we organize ourselves. In particular, the biggest problem that he sees is that most people are living a meaningless existence. Most people just spend all of their time pursuing pleasure, pursuing property, and pursuing themselves, really. And these are kind of the core tenets of liberalism. For Mussolini, he believes the pursuit of those core tenets is necessarily going to lead to a meaningless existence. Or maybe rather, that's better said as an animalistic, pleasure-driven existence. The separation of church and state is probably one of the most famous results Enlightenment era political theories. Liberalism, in particular, really advocated for this, right? It's why it's such an important part of the founding of the United States, because the United States was founded on these liberal ideals. Before the advent of these Enlightenment era political theories, the church and the state were really intermingled. In fact, we probably really couldn't talk about a state without understanding, the church, without understanding family heritage, without understanding a litany of other aspects of our lives that currently, right now, in the way that we live, are totally separated and isolated from one another, right? We want to separate out our political, our personal, our religious lives into separate, discrete, unique areas. For Mussolini, this separation, this isolation of all of these aspects of our lives, this atomization of ourselves, leads to this meaningless, only pursuing pleasure kind of existence. For Mussolini, the only way that we could return meaning to our lives is by giving ourselves over to something bigger than ourselves. And for him, the thing that we should be giving ourselves over to is the moral law. Now, this moral law is a project. It's a cultural project that has been handed down to us from our racial and cultural ancestors. And all bound up in this cultural project, all bound up in this moral law, are our conceptions of state, our conceptions of religion, our language, our ethnic identity, the way our economy functions, etc., etc., etc. By individually choosing to accept the moral law, we are making ourselves part of something so much greater than just us as individuals, right? We are now working arm in arm with people who share our same ideals and our same heritage, our same language, our same religion, our same government, and we're also looking back to people who inspired us to be at this place in the first place. Just like with Karl Marx, in order to really understand Mussolini, you have to understand his sort of theory of the progression of history. Mussolini doesn't see the progression of history as a scientific sort of class struggle. Instead, he sees the progression of history the same way that an organism might progress. He sees the progression of history as an organic thing. And so because Mussolini sees the development of history and the development of a state or a culture or a people as an organic development, he doesn't believe we should be so rationalistic about it. Rather, we need to just throw ourselves into whatever the moral law that we're choosing to adopt is. And under this conception, what is going on inside of a fascist state is that we have a re-merging of all those previously separated aspects of life. You know, our moral life, our spiritual life, our personal life, our political life, all merge back into one thing. And that is the fascist state. All of these separate things, religion, economy, governance, they are all now going to work together for the betterment of this particular moral project. So unlike Marx's goals of having a stateless, classless society, Mussolini wants a huge state. I mean, all he thinks there really should be is the state, and everything else should be participating that. And he definitely wants a lot of classes. You know, he wants people to be performing specific functions in society in order to further the goals and the pursuits of that society. Because Mussolini interprets things as organic, he really sees the fascist state as like a body. He sees it as us having unique and distinct things inside those institutions, not the people. The people all need to be the same, right? But inside those institutions, they all have unique traits. They all have unique jobs that have for themselves the purpose of maintaining the fascist body, the same way our organs do. So from the liberal standpoint, this is very authoritarian, right? The state itself is really in control of all the organs, just the way our body is kind of in control of all of our organs, or rather, all of our organs are, their job is to keep us going, to sustain us. That's for Mussolini, that's the job of all the different institutions inside of a state. But Mussolini wouldn't consider this authoritarian. You can only really consider this authoritarian from the liberal standpoint, because the liberal standpoint understands that like a big government is authoritarian. Mussolini doesn't see it as a big government, but rather as an organic body. Now, I usually don't give my own commentary about what I think about these things, but with fascism, it's a little dangerous. We gotta keep our head on a swivel for this, so I'm definitely going to be putting some caveats in here. That being said, though, it's totally authoritarian, and it's totally whack. Mussolini is adopting things that are entirely contingent. Mussolini is trying to raise things that are historically conditioned, like your language, your ethnicity, your culture. He's trying to make those the most essential aspect of ourselves. Mussolini's ideas are bad. They are really, really bad. Okay, you know, your ethnicity, your language, your particular cultural heritage, it's not the most important thing that should be determining how a government is run. When we start to lean into those kind of irrational modes of governing ourselves, we lead to things like Nazi concentration camps, right? We lead to things like a group feeling morally superior for the color of their skin or the language that they speak. It's absurd, and it's totally ridiculous, and it's a really, really bad way of governing. All of that being said, if you have some fascistic like tendencies or thoughts after reading all of this that you've discovered in yourself, that could be a little scary. There might be points that Mussolini makes that while you're reading, you're like, oh yeah, like that seems pretty reasonable, you know, and maybe you even kind of like his ideas. I want to let you know it is not your fault that you might be attracted to fascistic ideas. We do a very bad job at explaining what fascism is, or at least giving a concept of what fascism is. We really only associate fascism with the Holocaust or the Shoah, and that is a really poor way of identifying fascism, because if the Holocaust was the hallmark of what it means to be a fascist, then it happened back then, and fascism is no longer a threat. But that is not the hallmark of fascism. That was the inevitable result of fascistic ideology. Now, wrestling with meaning, wrestling with purpose in a secular age makes a lot of sense. A lot of philosophers have been discussing this really since the Enlightenment. Nietzsche is a great example, but he's not the only example. There are plenty of philosophers who are on the search for meaning in an age that seems to be entirely secular. Okay, I look forward to hearing y'all's comments about this. What do you think? Should we organize ourselves by adopting a moral law that was handed down to us by our ancestors, by the people who share our culture, our language, our ethnicity, etc.? Is this a good way to govern ourselves? Is this how we should be organizing ourselves? Does Mussolini's ideas seem like a good way to overcome some of the problems with liberalism? Okay.